I really like South Park. Like, almost to a weird extent. One of the standouts to me has always been the musical numbers.
Some people say that I'm a bad...
Not only is the music in the show well written and actually solid, functional pieces of music, but the lyrical content and the delivery and pacing is always just so top-notch. It's said that in comedy, timing is everything.
You always left me satisfied and smiling, so...
That's what she said!
The right comedic timing can even make flat jokes into something that just leaves you in tears. The other important factor to a good joke, though, is often some kind of clever twist.
What a twist!
But this isn't a video about writing better jokes. It's a video about creating better things. Originally, I wanted this to be a video just exploring the music of South Park and what makes it so funny and interesting and convincing. But along the way, as I was researching for it, I found a point that was just so much more interesting. And I think maybe better embodies the spirit of what this video was meant to be about anyway. Today's video is brought to you by me. I make some pretty affordable instruments for Decent Sampler, which is free. I think they're pretty neat and you might like them too. I also have a patron program you can join to get access to exclusive courses, presets, samples, and other stuff. Go me. In late 2011, Matt Stone and Trey Parker did a guest lecture at NYU about storytelling, focusing in on the MTV show called Stand-In. At this lecture, they dropped probably one of the most profound pieces of writing advice I've ever heard.
We found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words "and then" belong between those beats, you're f***ed.
With the emphasis on just those two words, they've maybe imparted one of the most important ideas in keeping your story interesting. And I think this idea applies incredibly well to music and, really in a broader sense, all forms of creative work. In this lecture, they go on to suggest some alternatives to the idea of "and then." You can either choose "but" or "therefore." And the more that you utilize these substitutions or even combine them, the more interesting the result becomes. So what does this actually mean for musicians and creatives? I think we're all familiar with the concept of call and response in music, and I think this is where the idea of "therefore" starts to come into play. This happens, therefore the natural resolution might be... And that's great, but the idea of "therefore" can offer up so many more interesting options. This happens, but because that has happened, therefore this is now possible. And that's the real beauty of this whole concept. We're playing with the idea of the listener's sense of anticipation and expectation that they've self-conditioned to based on the information provided so far, and then we're able to leverage that to create a moment of interest and intrigue and surprise. The idea of "but" is equally powerful. What if you're working on a piano piece, but it's actually working towards a sort of unexpected minimal techno track? Therefore, we could slowly introduce some occasional techie samples to break a listener's expectations without revealing an answer. But then we're able to deliver on a sense of anticipation with that sudden turn of events into a techno track that we've set up and created for the listener. Applying this idea of "but ... allows us to create a maybe more interesting version of a sense of a turn of events. Therefore is a useful tool, and it's a good way to provide this sort of ebb and flow and a sense of dynamics to something. But this idea of "but ... is arguably one of the more powerful tools we have as creators because it allows us to create a new set of conditions to occur without needing to provide a setup or even a context for them happening. The more you combine these processes, the more powerful the results can become. As you build the initial idea, you can expand into this happening, therefore this comes into play. But then this happens, which means that therefore this is the new result, and so on and so on. By not only taking this idea of but and therefore in place of and then to heart, but also by utilizing a free-flowing sense of exploration and fostering an environment of creative plasticity, the writers of South Park are continually able to deliver something that feels authentic and interesting and planned and coordinated instead of a show that seems to follow this consistent narrative that never really evolves or truly reacts and adapts. These ideas of being willing to explore alternative narratives and animation styles and perspectives, or even more off-the-wall ideas, leaves the process of South Park's creation to be entirely open to the larger abstract will of the process, and that's where I think the real magic lies. Now, this is all well and good, and I do think this is great advice, but I think the question then becomes, how do we condition ourselves as creators to embrace this more lateral frame of mind rather than defaulting to a sort of unconsciously deterministic system of creativity? It's one thing to hear advice like this from experts like Matt Stone and Trey Parker, but it's another game entirely to actually implement this into our own process. As creators, we're often creatures of habit. As artists, we have a certain visual style. As musicians, we have a preferred instrument or genre or even a harmonic comfort zone. As writers, we have a flow of storytelling and plot outlining and genre and such. And as game developers, we have a game engine that we prefer and blah, 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 blah. These same tools that we utilize in our creative process can also end up reinforcing these unspoken arbitrary limits that we impose on our own creative process. And I think maybe that's the real killer of the spirit of art. So what can we actually do to change that? One of the best ways to embrace a new mindset to the creative process is to simply give yourself the freedom of a fresh slate. When we walk into a creative session, we're often bringing some kind of expectation or even a goal with us, and that can be helpful, but it can also limit our ability to explore ideas. By giving ourselves the permission to look at each individual session as a self-contained fresh start or clean slate, we can create without needing to consider our previous failures, successes, or attempts, and rely on the structure of habit and conditioning to avoid them, replicate them, or at the very least, make them stay the same. Bringing a sense of gamification is also a great way to break out of your comfort zone to explore the buts and therefores of your process and ideas. Play is one of the most useful tools in creativity. Embracing a playful mindset of either an amateur or an exploratory free-writing mindset opens up our ability to not only explore new ideas and ways of thinking, but easier and more innovative ways to implement them, and even the more out there ideas that were so easy to just dismiss when residing in our normal process. The biggest creator of habit, though, is generally following that path of least resistance. We have our tools and conditions and parameters, but this is the same thing that forges that path to begin with. Sometimes this can manifest as a sense of laziness, but ultimately the idea of laziness is created from comfort in a sense of a default condition or a state of operating. By changing these default options, we can use this tendency of laziness and relying on known conditions to our advantage, and in turn to change the entire outcome of the process. Maybe Mick Gordon summed this up best in his excellent speech at GDC.
Change the process, change the outcome.
Because expectations are often what shape our idea of reality, if we understand that our nature as, humans, is to be imperfect, we can utilize this sense of imperfection as a catalyst for experimentation in the creative process, and then build a sense of confidence in our decision making, and our ability to in turn recondition our initial expectation when we start creating. When our expectation is not that of a defined result, but that as a process, we're able to embrace this but and therefore approach to creativity. Convention is also obviously a major factor in our process due to these weird predetermined notions of the nature of our creative work and process. The closer you find yourself to a condition or an experience that you've encountered before, the more likely you are to be influenced by its determining factors. I guess what this means is that if we force ourselves into a specific box, especially too early on in the process, we're automatically hindering our ability to explore alternative ideas and embrace the idea of change. And while at times limits can be helpful, when it comes to changing our frame of mind with creating, we instead need to rely less on applying labels and limits to define something and explore more of the possibilities that may allow that definition to take on a more finalized form, even if it's one that's unexpected. We place these unspoken, arbitrary limits on our process, and that's often the fundamental flaw that leads us down into the familiar land of and then syndrome endlessly, even though we may not recognize it. And then we wonder why the results might feel uninspired or too similar to be something worth pursuing. But if we're able to change these fundamental actions and conditions within our process and remove a sense of expectation, we're free to then create something in a new way that feels effortless. Therefore, it's never impossible to change if we're willing to put in the work. I guess all this is to say, arbitrary is the antithesis of creativity. And if you want to change your process, you have to learn how to change.
Does it smell like up dog in here?
What's up, dog?
Not much. What's up with you?